Good afternoon. I'm still reporting on the term regime change. Is this really a dirty word? Newsmax's 8 to 9 p.m. guy, Rob Finnerty, went way overboard in blasting Ambassador John Bolton for his stance on the ubiquitous and overused term regime change. President Trump's public stance is that the U.S. will not be involved in regime change. However, with the last remaining Iranian mullah still claiming victory against Israel and the United States in the recent 12-day war, it's clear that he intends to hold on to power until he is forcibly removed. Most unfortunately for the vast population of pro-American Iranians living in Iran, that means months to years of additional bloodthirsty repression of any who attempt to remove this last mullah from his throne. Israel is certainly capable of finishing this job, leaving Iranians free to pick and choose who shall govern their nation going forward into a very bright future. However, President Trump is committed to setting a new standard of absolute minimization of U.S. intervention in anything close to regime change going forward. So, what's a mother to do? This weird-looking professor explained it in simple terms just hours ago on Newsmax.
Two quick questions. One, where do you see the trajectory going? Has it changed dramatically at all, given what happened? And then I want to ask you about the War Powers Act for a second.
So, look, you're quite right about Israel. I'm sure they would like to finish the job, but they have such respect for Donald Trump that when they certainly could not refuse him when they said, stop, they stop. I think Israel's position is eliminate all enemies because they don't really go away. They say what they're going to, the question that Donald Trump should be saying to Ayatollah, are you going to still use words like wiping Israel off a map? Are we going to see video of people burning Uncle Sam in effigy? Are there going to be American burning flags? Because you did not obviously get the full message. And I think Israel, it's their region. They know this place. They know what they can negotiate with, who can deal with in good faith. Obviously, the Abraham Accord countries have an enduring peace. But the countries that Iran and the militias that they have supported, they are just a menace, and they need to all be eliminated. They've been degraded, but they're still there.
So the War Powers Act, okay. Democrats said not a word, of course, when it was used by Clinton or Obama or Biden. Do you think the president has the unilateral right to do what he did based on the War Powers Act? And by the way, is the War Powers Act even constitutional?
Yeah, look, it's not even a close call, right? I mean, you're right. Democratic administrations, whether it was in Libya, Syria, or Iraq, preemptively fired missiles. There's a difference between preemptive strikes, acts of aggression, and declarations of war. Right? That's a big difference.
Which we haven't had since 1942.
America, we were in Iran for 10 minutes.
Right.
You know, Rob, that's it. Yeah. We were there for 10 minutes. We were not fully militarily enabled. There was no boots on the ground. You know, there was no conscription. You know, its purpose, remember, was when the war in Vietnam went sideways in the bombing of Cambodia. So we were already there. We'd been fighting for years, and all of a sudden, we found another theater of war. That's what it was written for. Right. It was not for a preemptive strike where you go home and then say, look, did you get the message or not? I don't think Donald Trump needs the war powers. I think he can exercise commander-in-chief powers without the consideration of Congress, even if he went back again. Right. Unless you're committing yourself to a fuller-scale war, the War Powers Act, I'm not sure is in constitutional law, but certainly doesn't apply to these set of facts.
The United States is staring down a copper crunch. Global inventories hover at a 15-year low. Washington is floating import tariffs, and every EV, data center, and power grid build needs metal we don't control. Giant Mining Corporation's 9,800-acre Majaboo Hill project in Nevada is built for this supercycle. Highway, rail, power, and fiber on the claims. A recent hit of 170 feet at 0.4% copper with a 10-foot spike at 4.4%, an engineering firm already fast-tracking the modeling of the first resource estimate. While rivals tangle with new red tape, Majuba is sprinting towards development. Ticker BFGFF in the US and BFG in Canada. Dig in at giantminingcorp.com before the copper land rush prices you out. Last night, Newsmax's 8 p.m. slot guy, Rob Finnerty, ambushed Ambassador John Bolton with a gotcha trap concerning the way he interprets regime change.
Joining us now for more is the former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. Mr. Ambassador, nice to have you back on. I want to play for you your assessment of the strikes earlier this week on CNN. Take a listen.
I think President Trump made the right decision for America to attack Iran's nuclear weapons program. And I think we're on the verge of potentially seeing regime change in Iran as part of that.
Mr. Ambassador, do you stand by that tonight? Are you still in favor of regime change in Iran?
Yes, because it's the only way we can guarantee that the regime in Iran won't try to recreate the nuclear weapons program. They've already issued statements from the Supreme Leader, at least they've attributed the statements to him, that are very defiant of what the U.S. and Israel did. And I think it's part of their ideology, part of their aspiration for hegemony in the region and within Islam.
Well, let me ask you this, sir.
A central piece of it.
When you say regime change, do you mean by the people of Iran, or do you mean by U.S. Israeli military involvement?
Well, I think this would be principally by the people involved, and there wouldn't be any need for boots on the ground. Let me just say, the words regime change, in and of themselves, don't say anything about the mechanism.
Notice that Bolton has carefully parsed the meaning to be in line with his perception of what President Trump's intentions are for the mullahs' bloodthirsty reign over their mostly pro-American populace.
So those who say regime change must mean American boots on the ground are reading meaning into the words that the words won't bear.
Explain that. So you don't. So no U.S. military involvement, or are you strictly saying you hope the people of Iran rise up and do this on their own?
I'm saying regime change can occur in a lot of different ways, and in the case of Iran, I think the regime itself is weaker than it's been at any point since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. I think the U.S. could help the opposition. I think we could provide resources, communications equipment inside Iran. The opposition is very widespread, but it's not well coordinated, and they face a very determined group of fanatics that are running the government. So I think they could use some help. We can ask them what they think would be most beneficial.
That still seems respectfully sort of ambiguous. The opposition, people inside Iran that want to overthrow the Ayatollah, if I'm understanding you. The reason I ask is you've been in Washington for, what, more than 40 years, 50 years? You know Washington well. Could you provide us with a single example of a successful attempt at regime change? We couldn't think of one. Iraq, not a success. I think the people of Iraq would agree with that.
Well, can we take them one by one? Saddam
Well,
Hussein
hold on. Let me go through the list. Hold on, Mr. Ambassador. I'll give you the time to respond. Sir, hold on. I just want the audience to know. Iraq, Afghanistan, now run by the Taliban. Libya.
Oh, wait a minute.
Cuba,
That's not
the Bay of
because
Pigs, Somalia, the Sudan, Ukraine, the Maidan Revolution, Yanukovych. That was a disaster.
This is for fun, isn't it? The Trump administration negotiated in its first term a withdrawal agreement from Afghanistan that the Biden administration carried out. That's why the Taliban are back in power, not because we overthrew them after 9/11. Actually, regime change was working very well in Afghanistan.
It was working,
from our
Mr. Ambassador. It was working until we left.
You're an America Firster, aren't you? From the America First point of view, there had been no terrorist attacks mounted from Afghanistan since we intervened after 9/11, correct?
I agree with you. That's a different conversation, though. I'm talking about successful U.S. regime change, and the only two that we can think of was World War II and getting rid of the Nazis and, the American Revolution and replacing King George III with George Washington.
Whoa! Bolton slaps Finnerty back, but quite accurately. Before we proceed, Beth and I have never liked John Bolton. In fact, Tucker Carlson invited us to sit in on his show the last time Bolton was the guest to be interviewed. We were no more than 10 feet away from both of them during the interview. We supported Tucker's argument that Bolton had supported far too many regime change operations in the past. But here, Bolton calmly defends his position as Finnerty issues what can only be described as a well-planned attack that did nothing to illuminate the discussion of whether or not the U.S. should come to the aid of the vast majority of the Iranian population, which wants to do away with their radical overseers who have suppressed several attempts at internal regime change over the years in the past, probably taking lessons from both Russia and China in the fine art of dictatorial suppression of a population. This is a very important and overlooked point you hear wrongly repeated over and over again in this day and age, that there were no weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq. The truth is that WMDs were not found because Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, just before the start of the Second Gulf War, in anticipation of the American invasion of Iraq, sent all his WMDs to Syria by a massive truck caravan and over 150 C-130 flights. This historical fact was well documented by Saddam's Vice Air Marshal, General Georges Sada, in his book on the subject, Saddam's Secrets, published in 2006. However, there is no evidence that Saddam was able to get nuclear weapons. Another source of first-hand knowledge of Saddam's WMD programs came from Joyce Riley and Dr. Garth Nicholson, who were on the ground studying chronic illnesses like Gulf War syndrome as it related to Saddam's biological weapons program during and after the outbreak of the first 1990-1991 Gulf War. This nonsense that Iraq had no WMDs was invented by leftist Democrat Representative Dennis Kucinich from Ohio, Democrat Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, and Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts, whose so-called proof came from UN weapons inspectors who claimed only that they found no conclusive evidence of WMDs. There were WMDs in Iraq, and this fact needs to re-enter the American news lexicon as pure truth.
I think it was not in our interest to try and do nation building in Iraq, but the overthrow of the Saddam regime, I think, was definitely in our interest.
Let me play you a soundbite. This is something you had to say about the president's airstrikes and some of the reasoning maybe for those airstrikes on Saturday night. Take a listen.
I think what we're seeing here is a president driven by not U.S. national security interests, but his fascination with getting a Nobel Peace Prize. And he thought he had a mission that went flawlessly, and he jumped on it and said, this is great. Then he tried to get this ceasefire, which he created and bulled through and got upset on when it looked like that was about to fall through, to muddy up his victory. This is his story to get the Nobel Peace Prize, and he doesn't want to hear any contradiction.
Mr. Ambassador, and again, I'm just asking the question, but how could you possibly know something like that? Because the way that sounded to me was like someone who's on the outside looking in now, not a part of the administration, not getting credit for what appears to be, at least right now, Friday night, a very successful strike on Iran.
You know, in the part you played earlier, I said the president made the right decision. I'm just telling you why I think he made it based on 17 months of seeing him almost every day, multiple times a day. I think I know him pretty well, and I'm happy to stand by that point.
And you think he did this solely because he wants to win a Nobel Peace Prize, or did maybe part of the reason be because he doesn't want Iran to build a nuclear weapon?
Well, he had said frequently he didn't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. He had also said he didn't want to get involved in more foreign escapades. And I think he was very conflicted. He ultimately decided to do the right thing. I don't doubt it. But I also think he wanted to get back at the head of the parade with Bibi Netanyahu, so he got some of the credit.
Okay. Former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, appreciate you being with us tonight. Nice to see you, sir.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I wish you would appreciate the ability of the guests to answer your questions, and you don't do that. And I think it's very impolite and immature.
You know what, Ambassador? I gave you opportunities to reply to all of my questions.
You interrupted me. You kept talking. You didn't want the points answered. This is the way you conduct interviews. You're perfectly entitled to do it. You don't need guests to do that. Why don't you just talk for an hour straight?
Ambassador, the New Yorker wrote a piece about you. They say they call you John Bolton, the new warmonger in the White House. That was the New Yorker. And it just seems to me like you've had this fascination with war for your entire professional career. And sometimes I just think that given what we saw happen in November, 80 million Americans voting for Donald Trump, he won every battleground state, the House and the Senate. I just think that America sent a different message in November, and regime change is not something that the American people want to get involved in when it comes to Iran.
I'm glad to see that you think the New Yorker is that you're now relying on the New Yorker as your sources. There's a lot to talk about here. You are oversimplifying the circumstances, and in fact, when it came to a real decision on the use of power, Donald Trump did use power.
Okay.